which once bustled with manufacturing, mining, and farming. We all know from inspiration, history, and nature, we deserve a return to the success and growth of generations past, a birthright being squandered by corruption in Albany, and the depredations of an insecure, scheming mountebank posing as governor, who loathes both us and himself. As liberty beckoned to enslaved peoples behind the Iron Curtain via American broadcasts after World War II, we now say, believe, rise, and join us. Welcome to Radio Free New York.
Hello, everybody. This is your host, Andrew Hollister. Thank you so much for tuning in to Radio Free New York. You might notice if you're watching on the live stream, it doesn't look like I'm in the WYSL studio. And that's correct. I got a quick phone call or a text message from the studio. They said there are whiteouts and slippery roads. And for those who might not know, it takes me about 45 minutes or so to get to the studio. So I'm actually streaming from home today. And what that means is if you're watching online, the audio might be off just by a slight delay. And if you wanted to call into the studio today, you won't be able to call in, but you can send me a comment or a question on social media, and I will be sure to check those comments and respond to them throughout the show. And actually, today's show, I really do want as many comments from you guys as possible. I want to hear your feedback. I want to hear your questions, because we're going to talk about some stuff that is going to be maybe a little bit different perspective, and I really want to hear back from you guys, hear and know what you guys think about what I'm talking about today. So just to give you guys a little bit of a heads up, we're going to talk about hopefully three things today. We're going to talk about the New York State budget towards the end here, what's being proposed, how much it's going to cost, what the breakdown is. We're going to talk about the border wall a little bit, because the government's shutdown is still going on. They haven't come to an agreement, and a lot of it has to do with the wall. I'm going to give you guys my take on the wall and what we could do with the wall if we were to do something else. I'm going to throw maybe a different perspective out there for that. And then the first thing that we're going to talk about rolling into the show is actually kind of the opposite of a wall, building a bridge. And we're going to talk about building a bridge between the left and the right, kind of bringing those communities together. Over the last week and a half, I've talked about this on Facebook, and tons of opposing views kind of came just flooding in. And I think it's really important to have these discussions. So that's what we're going to do. We are just going to have some discussions, and I'm going to tell you guys about an experience I had this weekend with some leftist organizations, and really talk about opening those conversations. And we're just going to dive right into it. So I'm just going to check, make sure that the comments are coming in. Looks like you guys are commenting, rolling in. So thank you guys so much for joining on the live stream. I've got Dan, Christopher, Barbara, Nathan, Michelle, Jim, Chris, a whole bunch of you guys are jumping in. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to all the listeners on the radio waves as well. So the first thing I want to jump right into is talking about this whole left-right polarization, and the idea that the left and the right can't agree. There's just so much that they disagree on. This is the perception that people have. When I posted and asked about this, literally people commented back. I said, what do the left and the right disagree on? And some people said everything. They said absolutely everything. Other people said the truth. Some people said facts. Some people gave like really specific analysis. And what led me to ask that question was based on an experience I had this last weekend, where there was some right-leaning organizations there and some left-leaning organizations there coming together, discussing their differences, discussing their views of each other, their views, their personal views and beliefs, and what those differences were. And I think that you guys are going to find some interesting stuff. I found some very interesting stuff I didn't know. And before I dive into this conversation, I want to just kind of clarify, that I don't necessarily personally feel like I fall in what people would consider the right or the left. I don't identify that way at all. And I know maybe some people, you look at my beliefs and what I do, and you see where I am. A lot of times I'm with Second Amendment organizations, and people automatically assume, oh, then you're just like a guy on the right. And really, I don't classify myself as right or left. Instead, I just have some basic principles that I live by. The principles of we should have small and limited government. The principles of like the non-aggression principle or non-aggression policy, that inherently you shouldn't be aggressive towards other people. You shouldn't bring violence to other people or force against other people. And if that person or group is not bringing violence or force or aggression towards you, you shouldn't be engaging in those actions towards them either. The principles of just having individual liberties, freedom of choice, and also defending those liberties for other people, even if they don't feel the way I do, even if they don't think the way I do. Maybe they have a different religious background, maybe they come from somewhere totally different. I firmly believe in defending their rights to be different than me. So those are just the principles I live by. Now, some people listening, you might go, well, that's what the right stands for. And interestingly enough, people on the left, and you guys are going to hear this, are going to hear some of that and go, well, that's what the left stands for. And so it's pretty interesting, I guess, what we went through this last weekend. But I want to just get the conversation started. So maybe one of the most profound terms that came up during this discussion was the idea of artificial political divides. And I think that is just a great way to start the conversation. The idea of artificial political divides, these ideas of these things that divide the left and the right, that have been portrayed by media or have been portrayed by the most extreme on the right and the most extreme on the left. And then the media and the talking heads sit there and try to make it sound like that's how everybody is, painting with a really broad brush. So I'm just going to dive right in, talk about some of these things, because these are things that were expressed to me and to others at this during this conversation. This is their words, the way they described it. Hopefully I don't screw it up. This is how I perceived the discussion to go. So the very first thing off the bat that I realized, and this took a little while, but I kind of, you watch facial reactions and body language, and you start picking up certain key things and vocabulary. And the first thing I noticed is that these people, they call themselves leftists. And to me, I think that for a long time, the media has really portrayed three individual groups as one, three ideologies as one. And this was leftists, progressives, and liberals as one. And what I found out is there are actually three different ways of thinking, which I did not know. And I think a lot of people who I talk with didn't know that either. And these people, they called themselves leftists, and they were very, very clear that they don't like liberals at all. They think liberals give them a terrible, terrible name. And the same thing with progressives. They were opposed to progressives. And I was kind of really surprised by this, because the names are used so interchangeably in the media and on social media and in groups that I see. I was surprised that they identified differently and that they actually opposed those views. So that was the first thing that I found as very interesting, very different, and wanted to make sure that I shared that with you guys as listeners. Now, the other thing that is probably a misconception is that these people, once again, they call themselves leftists. They're extremely pro-Second Amendment, very pro-Second Amendment. And their idea of being pro-Second Amendment has a slightly different variation to it, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they believe in the right to bear arms, and the right to defend themselves, and the right for others to defend themselves, and the right for anybody to defend themselves. The differing in belief is that they basically specified that they wish that they didn't need it. And I think that people on the right would say the same thing. Like, I wish there was no need for firearms in the world. So, what one person said is, yes, I carry a firearm. I just wish I didn't need to. And so that was kind of like interesting to me, because a lot of the people I know, once again, I hang out in Second Amendment groups, which typically in my area are predominantly people on the right. They love carrying their gun. I personally very much enjoy shooting. I enjoy my firearms. I enjoy, like, going on the internet and seeing the cool new rifle that came out and kind of like wishing that I could afford it, or wonder how great it would be to shoot that. Whereas some of these people had mentioned, yeah, they're not so interested in firearms. They believe in the right to defend themselves. They actually own firearms. They carry firearms. They just kind of have that feeling of they wish they didn't have to. They wish they didn't feel that way in society, that was necessary. So that I think was another thing that's like a big misconception of the left, is that they are just like totally against your Second Amendment rights, totally against firearms. And they're not at all. They just don't like the idea of needing to have them, but they still own them. They still have them. So what we're going to do now, guys, we're going to take a little break. When we come back, I'm going to tell you just a few other things that I think would be surprising to the right, people on the right, that were also surprising to me, that these people brought to the table and shared about the leftist way of thinking. Then after that, we'll roll right into the wall. So we're going to take a quick break here on Radio Free New York, and we'll be back in about a minute.
We'll treat you like family at Mark's Pizzeria. We'll treat you like
all's good, thanks.
Pizzeria. Great pizza, fresh and good. Simply the best in your neighborhood. Come in, we'll get to know you. Call you by name. We can bring it to you any time of the day. Mark's Pizzeria. We'll treat you like family. Mark's Pizzeria.
This is Dom Genova, owner of Genesee Valley Motors in Avon, your no-nonsense car dealer. Well, we're your no-nonsense truck dealer, too, selling Rams and Fords up to the mightiest that they make. And we have a shop with Master Techs open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. 6 days a week, even Saturday, so you can get your truck serviced when it's not billing hours for you. You may not be used to that. Visit RochesterWorkTrucks.com. That's RochesterWorkTrucks.com.
You're listening to Radio Free New York
on the WYSL stations.
All right, guys, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister, broadcasting from home today because the roads weren't so great and there was whiteout conditions, so we're here at my home broadcasting. So Bob Savage isn't with me, and I cannot take phone call questions or comments, but if you hop on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter and comment on the live stream there, I am monitoring the comments as they come in, responding to them, and I really would like to get more comments from you guys and hear more from you. So Nathan says, and just let me take one step back. So we're talking about the left and the right and maybe how we can build bridges between the two of them. And before we talk about that, I'm talking about some of the things that might be surprising to people on the right that people on the left that I've spoken with have expressed to me. Now, I'm not saying that this is how everybody on the left believes. In fact, these people told me that it's not. They consider themselves leftists, and they don't like the way liberals and progressives do things and their actions and their beliefs. So it's kind of a distinction that I wasn't aware of, and I wanted to share with you guys. So looking through the comments on the break here, Nate says that both the left and the right agree on bloated government. And, I'm not going to totally disagree with you there because, yeah, there's a lot of people on the right and on the left that their idea of government is a kind of a big conglomerate that tells you what to do and how to do it and that they're going to tax you. But one of the things that I actually learned in that meeting is, and I always, there are a lot of people that are pro small government that believe in a small, limited government. And I was actually surprised that people on the left, they agreed. They wanted a small government. They wanted a much smaller government, which was kind of a surprise to me. And I think that that's actually some of the differences that you start to see between progressives and leftists. That progressives are the ones that want this big nanny state that takes care of you, whereas these people who differentiated themselves as leftists actually talked about the concept of mutual aid. And that was their idea and their way of how people could be taken care of. And that's just the idea of helping others. And where have we heard that before? I mean, we've talked about it so many times on the show. You see it all the time. The idea is that communities used to come together and help each other, help your neighbor, help those in need. This is actually one of their ideologies, one of the things that they promote. And their idea of how mutual aid works is very much aligned with how I've heard anybody else on the right or anywhere in between really talk about it. The idea that you help somebody without questioning what their political affiliation or background is, what their race is, what their religion is, where they came from. You see a person in need, a human being in need, and you reach out and you help them. And so they call it mutual aid. Some people would call it being a good Samaritan. Some people would just call it being involved in your community, being active in your community. This is actually one of their core principles. So that's something that, I think a lot of people don't know about. They don't hear about. They hear, well, people on the left just want the government to take care of them. Well, there's at least a piece of the left that's not what they believe in. They believe in community taking care of their community, which I hear a lot of people on the right say that's like strictly a right thing. But this is kind of like breaking that barrier and breaking down those artificial political divides that the media portrays and some of the loud talking heads portray. So it was pretty interesting. And Barbara commented in on Facebook and said, she's always said that there is more in common between the left and the right than there isn't. And I would say, based on the discussion I had over the weekend, that's totally true. I would say that 90% of what was being talked about, if not more, was agreed on. I mean, people agreed on so much, and you look at the spectrum of all the things you could agree on and all the things you could disagree on, and really it is such a small sliver of stuff that's disagreed on when you look at the left and the right. So this is just, I want to have this conversation and make sure that we're really talking about this and looking at individuals and looking at each other and having these conversations, because the left and the right being divided, working against each other instead of with each other, serves purpose for only one group. And that's the elite. That's the top level, group of government officials. Really, it helps the government. The government is much better off if we, the people, are divided. But if we, the people, come together with commonality and common goals, we can actually take our governments back, and we can actually start working on some of these things we agree on, like our Second Amendment rights, which, as you guys know, in New York are dwindling day after day after day. There's a new bill that was proposed that I'm just mind blown. I think it's Senate Bill 1412, if I remember. And if we have time during the show, we'll talk about it. But it's a newly proposed bill that has so many different restrictions on firearm ownership, to the point where if you want to buy a shotgun or a rifle in New York State, if this bill passes, you won't be allowed to anymore if you don't have a hunting license. And it raises the age to 21. It does like all of these things. Well, if the right and the left were united on this front, it wouldn't even be a question of this bill being proposed, much less a question of if it would get passed. So this is just one small example of the type of legislation that the people could actually fight against if we were united and having these conversations. Another thing that they brought up, which this was maybe a perception from the left of the right that I thought was interesting, and that was that the leftists, their view was that the people on the right, their idea of community defense is strictly guns. That's it. And to be honest, I know organizations that, yeah, that's true. Their idea of community defense is strictly firearms, strictly your Second Amendment rights, nothing else. And so the leftists, they kind of challenged that thought and that ideal, and they said, we see community defense as so much more than that. We see community defense as not just guns, but includes guns. But it's also food, medical supplies, medical attention, treatment and services, shelter, being physically responsible and having your finances in order. Those were the type of things that they, in their definition, call community defense, which is interesting because to me that sounds like being self-sufficient. And, being able to take care of yourselves, take care of your community without the government. And they're like, yeah, that's what we believe. Like, we shouldn't need the government to take care of us. We should be self-sustainable. Our community should be able to take care of itself. So I hear all this and I'm like, yeah, these are like some of these things are what the media would portray as totally polarizing from the left and the right. And once again, this isn't to say everybody on the left believes this. This isn't to say everybody on the right believes this. This is to say that these conversations aren't happening. And if they are happening, which they probably are on a small scale, the media is avoiding it like the plague. The government and the media does not want people to know about these conversations or have these conversations, because then you'll realize some of the most polarizing topics that are keeping people divided, the left and the right actually agree on. And if they actually agree on these issues, there is no reason that we should have the fights that we're having and have the conflicts that we're seeing here in our nation and in our state. So I'm just going to take a real quick peek here at the comments here. Oh, there's a whole bunch of them. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to the comments during the break when we go on a break. So before we go on a break, let's talk about the things that cause the divide between the left and the right. And this is actually another thing I posted on social media this week, and I think it had hundreds of comments. I couldn't even keep up with it. I want to share with you guys. Well, I'll tell you guys about a few of the comments. So some of the comments were very broad sweeping, as was the other question. The thing that causes the divide is the truth, is facts. Some people said the media. Other people said things like abortion and Second Amendment rights. And I'm just going to give you my perspective. My perspective was two major factors. Those two major factors were media, which I think many of us will agree on, that media is the biggest factor causing the divide. But the second thing I noticed during our meeting, during our time together, our conversations, was that vocabulary. Vocabulary was the second piece of the divide. And you guys might be thinking, what do you mean vocabulary? We all speak English. And that's true. We all speak English. But what I identified and I noticed throughout our discussions was we would use a word that to us meant freedom, liberties, maybe commerce unrestricted by government. And that word didn't mean the same thing to them, and vice versa. They would maybe mention a term or a word that to us was like, oh, whoa, you believe in that? And then we realized, we said, well, when you say that, what does that mean to you? And when we got to the bare basics of the discussion, what we realized is there are two very different perspectives, and two is very broad, right? There's probably even more than that, but in general terms, we found that the media, and depending on which media you follow, uses terms in a different way, that by these two separate groups is taken in a different way. So I would explain it as if you've ever spoken with somebody from the UK, right? British English. We speak English, right? American English and British English. There's a lot of the same words, almost all the same words. But they call things like feminine hygiene products napkins over there. So if you ask for a napkin at the dining room table, you might get like a weird look. They're like, "You what? This isn't the place to ask for that." And maybe you're not female, so they're just like even stranger. That's kind of what we were experiencing. And so to kind of play into this, the media makes a ton of money off of this controversy of things that is just an issue with vocabulary. So I'll give you guys like a really, really basic example. And this is something that makes sense if you really talk it out. And we're talking, I mean, we spend hours together talking about this sort of stuff. So the first is we talk about constitutional liberties, right? That's a very big topic. You know, your freedom of speech, your freedom to the Second Amendment, like that sort of thing. And to us, that means the Bill of Rights. That means your right to bear arms. It means your, you know, just liberties that you would expect every human being should have access to. Human rights, basic human rights. To leftist organizations, and this isn't to say all of them, the idea of constitutional rights and liberties can be offensive. And when you hear that, you go, what do you mean? They don't believe in rights? And that's literally what people are thinking. Like, you don't believe in rights? And that's not why. And in fact, they believe in the same rights, but they look at them as basic human rights. Your basic human rights to have freedom of speech, to have freedom to defend yourself, to have freedom of travel and commerce, like that sort of things. They see as basic human rights for all people in the world. Whereas when they hear constitutional liberties, that sounds exclusive to them. That sounds like, oh, the Constitution is an old document that was written by rich white men. And that's what they hear. They hear a document that was written that wasn't inclusion. It didn't include women, didn't include people of color. And therefore, when they hear constitutional liberties, they don't hear human rights. It's just a language barrier. You talk through it and say, no, I believe all constitutional liberties apply to all people, regardless of race and color. And sure, the Constitution was amended. Let's get that out of the way. We all know that the Constitution was amended to include women's rights, people of color, minorities, all of that. But that doesn't change the way they see it in their mind, because the founding document, which a lot of people say, the original intent of the Constitution was, and then we talk about our Second Amendment rights. Well, when they hear the original intent of the Constitution was, they think, yeah, to include only land-owning white males. So that's just one example. I see we got to come up on a break here. I'm going to give you guys the second example when we come back from this next break. We'll take about a minute break. I'm going to try to read through as many of these comments as I can and respond to them when we get back here in a moment.
You're listening to the voice of liberty.
WYSL.
AM 1040 Avon Rochester, FM 92.1 Rochester, FM 95.5 Spencerport, and WYSL1040.com everywhere.
At University Eye Specialists, I see many patients who suffer from dry, irritated, or itchy eyes. Sometimes these symptoms are often due to severe dry eye. Over-the-counter eye drops often help, but sometimes dry eye may require treatment with prescription medication. Dry eye is a very treatable medical condition that should be taken very seriously. The health of your eyes is very important to us. Please feel free to call any one of our local offices for an appointment.
In America, we are living longer, healthier lives. The longer we live, the more likely we are to develop eye conditions such as glaucoma, macular degeneration, and diabetic eye disease. If you are over the age of 40, it's important to have a thorough eye examination in order to identify vision-threatening conditions at an early stage. At University Eye, we have the technology and experience to screen for and to treat glaucoma, macular degeneration, and diabetic retinopathy. At University Eye, your vision is our mission.
Phone 1-800-724-0938.
You're listening to Radio Free New York
on the WYSL stations.
All right, right, guys, we're back here on Radio Free New York. I'm your host, Andrew Hollister, broadcasting from home today. So if you're on the live stream, I'm sorry, the audio is probably off by a little bit. It might look like it's dubbed. If you're listening on the radio, you probably notice no difference whatsoever. So the topic that we're talking about is building a bridge between the left and the right, and just starting the basis of the conversation. In fact, I'm hoping in the future maybe I bring some of these people on the show and we talk about these things and just have this conversation about what does the left believe, what does the right believe, and really what are the differences, but more importantly, what do we agree on? So I'm just going to run through two more things, and then we're going to talk about the wall, because the government's still shut down, which I don't personally have a problem with. I think it's actually causing more good in this country than harm, and but we'll talk more about that in a minute. So just two more things real quick that are a vocabulary issue between the left and the right that causes disagreement, even though they agree typically, would be the idea of capitalism and markets. So on the left, people will say, we need to get rid of capitalism. And a lot of people on the right go, what? You want to take away my right to run a business? You want to, take away free commerce and open commerce and stuff like that. And it sounds like you want socialism, a socialist country. Don't get me wrong. There are people, democratic socialists especially, that's totally what they believe. But what these guys explained to me was really eye-opening, because their idea of what capitalism is not an open free market. In fact, when they talk about what many people on the right consider capitalism to be, their word for it is markets. And where have we heard markets before? That's a very libertarian thing. So my libertarians who are listening to the show are like, yeah, of course we believe in markets. The idea of capitalism, what they are opposed to in capitalism is the government regulations involved in capitalism that forces small businesses to not be able to compete with large businesses. That actually sounds reasonable. Yeah, I hate it when government comes in and picks winners and losers and says, hey, giant corporation, we're going to give you millions of dollars in tax subsidies as a bribe to come into our state, to come into our area, and to make you more rich. And oh, by the way, since you have this huge competitive advantage because you're paying millions of dollars less in taxes, all the small businesses in your town and area go away. And then when the government subsidies run out, big business leaves. Now it's a ghost town. So when they say they're opposed to capitalism, that's what they're talking about. But when many people on the right hear we're opposed to capitalism, you automatically think, oh, they mean socialism. It's like a one or the other, like it's binary. But through the discussion, it actually turned out that no, they don't want socialism either. That's terrible. What they want is free markets. And that's the idea that you should be able to conduct business without oppression from the government. So to me, that was like an eye opener, to me. And I could tell looking around the room, people were like, wow, this is amazing. This is totally like what we believe in. We're just using different words for it. The other thing I'll leave you guys before we step into talking about the wall is the idea of trust and how trust is established, earned, and that whole ordeal. So, and this is something where the left and the right seem to appear to, based on this conversation, differ. What they said, and this is kind of like what echoed through the room. So the groups on the right said, I trust somebody when they prove that I can trust them. I'm not trusting right away. I don't trust people readily. And the kind of the term or the idea was trust is earned. So when people on the right, and this is very general, this is just based on the discussion we were having this weekend, they would say, a lot of times they don't necessarily take things at face value. They want to prove it first. They want to go through, research it, and make sure what they're hearing and what they're seeing is actually true. So they're very much skeptical. Whereas the groups on the left said they were more trusting. And they said, if somebody comes to me and says that they were abused by somebody, we just take them at their word, at face value, unless they give us a reason not to believe them. So that's one of the things I saw was different. Is they're more trusting, which I don't see as a bad thing at all. I also don't see a bad thing of people wanting to have trust earned. So that's going to be a different thing, but that gives you a little bit of perspective when you see people arguing on the left and on the right, where maybe somebody's really, really skeptical and somebody's more willing to believe. You have to understand that's just a difference of beliefs, and you shouldn't get hung up on those things. You should just acknowledge, okay, that's your belief system. Where can we find common ground? So I'm going to use that as the end of the discussion about talking about building bridges between the left and the right. And now we're going from bridges to walls, right? So we're going to talk a little bit here about the wall. You guys know that government's still shut down. They're kind of having discussions now, but they haven't really gone anywhere yet. And it's still centering around the funding of the wall. And what we could talk about, we could totally talk about how just a few years ago, Democrats supported funding the wall, and now because it's Trump's wall, they hate it. But that's not what I want to talk about. Instead, I want to talk about what could we do instead of a wall? What could we do that would be effective instead of a wall? Now, for those of you who were with Larry and I in our Rochester tour or saw us on Facebook Live, some of this you might have already heard, but for a lot of you, this will probably be the first time you're hearing of this concept. And the concept is 2 Ellis Islands on the southern border of the United States. So what would that look like? Maybe one in Texas, maybe one in Arizona. I don't know. But this is the concept, the idea of 2 border entries in the southern border of the United States where people can come into the country legally. And the idea of this is that people can come in, get checked out for diseases, get checked out to see if they have the right vaccines, make sure they're not criminals, make sure they're not terrorists that want to do harm to people, and go through a legal process to come into the country. Then what happens from there? Well, the first thing is people now have a safe way into the country. So the very first step, the very first idea with this is we shouldn't have children dying in the desert anymore. Women and children trying to get to the U.S. border illegally now have an opportunity to say, we don't need to do that. We don't need to be extorted into paying money to a coyote to illegally smuggle us across the border. We can just go to the Ellis Island. We can go there, and we can do it legally. Then they get a temporary work visa, whether that's 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it is. You go in, you get checked out, you make, you're able to work, you're healthy, you're not bringing diseases across the border, you're not a criminal. You come into the country legally. And we use a concept that was actually a good concept from DACA. Now, DACA had a lot of bad things in it. It was very broken, but there was one good concept in there, and that was the idea that every 2 years, these people had to check in. The government had to know where they are. They had to check in every 2 years. Now, I don't know what's appropriate for this idea. I don't know if it's 6 months. I don't know if it's a year. I don't know if it's 2 years. That's something we can work on. But the idea that you can come in and the government knows where you are and you're checking in with them, and here's the next piece, you can't go on welfare. So what does that mean? You come into the country legally on a work visa that's easier to get to and that's accessible. You pay taxes like everybody else, but you are not allowed to go on welfare. What does that mean? That means that these people come across and they're actually paying us to be allowed to work here. And they're not going to be illegal. They're not going to be undercutting American labor working under the table because they're legal. And if they can't prove that they're working, then when their follow-up, they're going to lose their visa. They're going to go back. So this I think is a really good idea because this changes Border Patrol entirely. Now we know the people crossing the border are actually bad people. They're criminals because they could just come through the border legally if they aren't. So that's step one, that it would totally change how we handle border patrol, border security, and allow border patrol to be looking for criminals and protect people from trying to cross the border just looking for a better life. But there's another thing that it does. If people are legal, this will help law enforcement immensely. Why will it help them? Because right now, if law enforcement is looking for somebody who should be deported, who is a criminal, and they go into these communities of people who are illegal or undocumented, whatever you want to call them, personally, I call them illegal because they broke the law with what they're doing. Then they go there, there's all these illegals, and they say, hey, where is so-and-so? Where is this guy? Nobody will talk to the police. They don't want to open their doors, nothing, because they're worried about being deported. They're not going to cooperate with the police because they're illegal too. Of course not. They're terrified. But if they were legal and all of them were legal and just that one person wasn't, because they're actually a criminal, they're actually a bad person, they actually committed a crime, you would see these communities go, he's over there. He's right there. Guys, go get him, because now they have vested interests. They are now a part of the community. They don't have to worry about being deported because they're following the rules. So just to kind of give you guys a real quick recap on this, we build 2 Ellis Islands and allow people to have a legal path into our country to get a temporary work visa, to be checked up on every 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever is appropriate, and for them to show that they're being productive members of society who are paying taxes. They don't have the ability to collect welfare, but maybe at some point they could work towards a green card or citizenship. I'm not even talking about that piece yet. I'm just talking about an alternative to the wall. They come into the country legally, they check in with the government, and then we have only the people who are actually criminals, only bad people are trying to cross the border. Border Patrol can focus on those people. These people integrate into our communities because they're legal. They don't have to worry about being reported on. And they actually report on the people who are bad people who are there illegally. So I think that's what we can do in place of a wall that would actually make things generally better overall in communities across the country who are dealing with this type of issue. So that's it. We're going to take a quick 1-minute break here, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the New York State budget.
From Avon Feed and Supply, introducing Dry Shod waterproof footwear. Dry, comfortable feet, even on those warmer days. Avon Feed has a big selection of dry shod for men and women, offering fully flexible athletic shoe sizing for great fit and maneuverability. Its exclusive insulation breathes and keeps you warm without bulk, and you'll stay dry top to bottom with state-of-the-art waterproofing. While you're at Avon Feed, find everything for your pet, from feeding bowls to toys, leads, collars, beds, crates, and tie-outs. Avon Feed and Supply has what the big pet chain stores will never have. Tim Cole and his great knowledgeable staff. And if you think you'll save money at that pet superstore, well, think again. While you're at Avon Feed, don't forget the two-legged pets with River Rat Thousand Island cheese in great flavors, including hard to find mean and nasty. Plus, once again, nut butters, Nunday mustards, and Rickles pickles. Open weekdays 9 to 6, Saturday 9 to 4. Avon Feed and Supply. West Main Street at the bottom of the hill, just west of the Circle.
You're listening to Radio Free New York
on the WYSL stations.
We're not going to make America great again. Wait.
And I'm just scrolling through some of the comments here on YouTube and Facebook, and I'm just going to respond to a couple of them before we talk about the New York State budget. Albert on YouTube says, and this is in response to, we were talking about the left and the right disagreeing with each other over vocabulary and talking about the same things or totally different things but using the same words, and that's part of why they disagree. So Albert says when he went to the Philippines, his brother asked the fast food cashier for a napkin, and she was totally weirded out because they were probably using British English over there, and a napkin is not a napkin in English over there. It's actually a feminine hygiene product. So, and who knows, it could be something totally different in other parts of the world that speak English. Just because we're using the same words doesn't mean they mean the same thing to us. And then Christopher on Facebook says, also talking about, opposing views and stuff, the idea of rhetoric and virtual signaling. And that actually came up during the discussion. And the leftists said that that is one of the biggest issues that makes them so upset, and makes other communities upset too. When people come in, and they would call these people liberals. So they differentiate themselves from liberals. And they say, yeah, liberals will come in and virtual signal, and they'll show up to, like, some tragic event in the community, jump in front of the camera and try to, make it look like they really care, but then never go back to that community, never actually help that community. They're just virtual signaling, standing up, saying something, but not actually engaging and working to make it better. So that's something that they talk about. They identify as a huge issue on their side of the aisle, that they're working on and trying to address. And so for me, that was like, that's amazing that they know it's a problem and they're working on it, because I don't think people see or hear about that. So that's a great point there. Let me see if there's anything else. I think that those, somebody had mentioned that, people on the left post a lot on Facebook about things like racism. It's hard to live and go through it if you're the one being attacked. And I would say, and then kind of goes on and says, or, stop Trump, pay people, this and that. These are some statements that I think the best thing you can do is, if you really care about these issues, go into these communities and be involved with them. It's one thing to just make a statement online, racism is bad. Yeah, I think the general population agrees that racism is bad. There's a lot of people there's people clearly on the internet, we see this, that don't think racism is bad. So the first step is, yeah, I agree racism is bad. But don't just say that. Do something about it. Go into a community and show you care. Because actions speak louder than words. And what they have is a lot of people shouting from the rooftops about things, but not actually taking action. And that's where virtual signaling and stuff like that comes into play. If you're going to take this message and project it, actually do something. And then people will take you seriously, and they will be engaged and start doing the same thing. One of the things that came up is, when you show up in the community to make a difference, that immediately challenges people's idea of what's possible, because now you're there. Now you can actually take action. You can do something. And don't just show up once to take pictures, because then they know you're just full of crap. No, show up, be there, be engaged in these communities. You'll make a difference. You really will. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, you can make a difference. So speaking of sides of the aisle, the New York State legislature only has one side of the aisle now, really. The Democrats control the executive branch. They control the Senate and the Assembly. And us in New York, we're going to probably pay pretty dearly for this. So I'm just going to run through. We're going to talk about the budget. I know we don't have a ton of time left, and there's a lot in here. So if I sprint through this, I apologize. If you guys have questions, post them online. If I can't get to them, we can always follow up on Monday's show. So the very first thing is, our budget this year is proposed to be $175.2 billion, billion with a B, which is up another 2% from last year's budget. So another $3.5 billion more than last year's budget. What that equates to, just to put this in perspective for people, is over $8,000 per person in New York right now. $8,000 for every man, woman, and child. Doesn't matter if you're an infant, or 2 years old, 18 years old, or 90 years old. Your share is $8,000 a person. Now, I tried to do some research to see, well, what does that equate to per taxpayer? Because that's kind of a more important number, I think, is what is the burden on the average person who's paying taxes? And no surprise here, the number of taxpayers in New York doesn't appear to be published anywhere that I could find on the New York State website. So best I could do, I used the Bureau of Labor website published by the federal government and some other stuff. And the number I came up with was just a little bit over $18,000 per taxpayer in New York State. I can't say it's a hard number because the statistics were really hard to find. So I had to go based off of the number of people working in New York State. I'm sure we could FOIL request it, but, it would take, probably 6 months or so before they'd get back to me. So that means if you're a taxpayer in New York, your burden, your share in this budget is about $18,000. Now, that doesn't include your property tax. That doesn't include your local school tax. That's just the state's budget. And don't forget, there's unfunded mandates that the state pushes on your town and county that aren't included all in that budget. That's up to local government to pay for. So this is just immense. When we talk about being the highest tax burden state in the nation, it's no joke. I mean, we're literally taxing the crap out of people. So where's this money going? First thing that they upped is education spending. Now, education spending is one of those things that's really feel good, warm, and fuzzy. That got bumped up another $1 billion. So now we're up to $27.7 billion. And you'd sit there, you'd hear that, you'd think about that and go, well, it's good to spend money on education. We need people educated, right? So we've got about an estimated 2.6 million students in New York State, which puts us at about $10,500 per student per year, kicked in by state government. Then local government actually throws in another $7,000 to $14,000 per student. Last year, in 2018, on a national level, New York State spent 90% more than the national average for 3-minute education. 90% more. But we only got to being ranked 36th in the nation for education. So we're way below average, but we spend 90% more. And on top of that, in some areas like math and reading comprehension, we ranked even lower than that. So this new increase actually puts us close in some districts in New York State to spending 130% more than the national average, more than double. The national average is about $11,000 per pupil per year, and some states actually spend $7,000 and less per pupil per year. So we're spending a lot of money on education without the right results. We could spend an hour talking about that, but we've got about 2 minutes left. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The thing that concerns me is we've got a $3.1 billion, once again, that's billion with a B, budget gap, which means we're going to spend $3 billion more this year than is projected that we're going to take in. So New York State's going to go another $3 billion in debt. I think we're the second highest debt holding state in the nation right now. I think the only people that hold more debt than us is, surprise, California. So a couple other things to run through real quick. We're going to have a 3.6 increase spending on healthcare. They also want to make the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, state law in New York because they're worried that it may get repealed. We're calling again for the 2% cap on property tax, which we all know is fake. It's not real because the local governments find other ways to bring that money in, whether it's through increased fees or law enforcement as a property center or just declaring an emergency. We're also going to spend, us from upstate, $836 million on New York State or New York City's subway system. So a system that we'll never use. We're paying for it for New York City. We're also giving them another $250 million for a housing authority in New York City that we won't have access to either. So that's just a sneak peek at the budget. It hasn't been approved yet, but this is what they're proposing and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'll put some links on YouTube for you to read through the whole budget proposal, and we are out of time for today. So guys, thank you so much for joining me here on Radio Free New York, and I will catch you guys on Monday.
Hey, very good. Thanks.